Thanks very much, Maria, and it's a great pleasure. And I really want to welcome, particularly and especially, our international guests and also our friends and colleagues from the various libraries in South Africa and on the continent. I was mentioning to Maria that when we were looking at when Maria joined us. I think she joined us as the executive director for the Library and Information Center in March last year, and it feels like it's been a longer period, and I had to reflect on that for a moment. And we said that we really have to, the university at the time was contemplating on its strategy for the fourth industrial revolution, because the university's strategy is for global excellence and stature, but we renew our approach through the contextualization, and the appropriate contextualization that we had embarked on was for the fourth industrial revolution, partly because our Vice-Chancellor and Principal, Professor Chiliti Marwala, comes from a background in computational intelligence, and he reminded us that the world is in fact changing, and how do we take that changing and not be changed by those changes, but be part of the group that will in fact bring about that change. We, as a university, and often you see pictures of a library where there is a connection of, a connection of books or of ebooks, whatever it might be, into a brain or into the mind of a person. And I must really say that for us as a university, the library is really the heart. And as you have witnessed, our colleagues that welcomed you this morning prior to me, is that you are really, when you are with us here, you are not really just engaging with us from a rational point of view, but this is really a relational space where you engage with the heart of the institution. And so thank you once again for joining us. Maria requested that I try to contextualize the fourth industrial revolution in the higher education space, but also in the context of South Africa. As you know, I think it was a few days ago and also earlier sometime this year, when the aspect came about in 4I about the fourth industrial revolution in Parliament, and people were then asked that if you talk about the fourth industrial revolution, you must be able to talk about the previous three. So, by the way, 4IR is not equal to 3IR plus 1IR. There is no STEAM involved in this. Maybe there is a STEAM, but a different type of STEAM. Maybe it's science, technology, arts, engineering, and mathematics kind of a STEAM that gets involved in the fourth industrial revolution. But as you say, I do want to distinguish a little between the different revolutions and what were the key contributors to these revolutions, to try to contextualize a bit for us, particularly for South Africa, and of course how we relate to this in the global context. The first industrial revolution, as I mentioned earlier, was about, I think it had the energy component may have indeed been steam, much more mechanization. Second, electricity. The third, often the key technology that's looked at is transistors, but then transistors gave rise to communication technology, to computing technology, and the convergence is what you have in your pocket. And that's your mobile phones. And so that convergence, I think, was very key in what would constitute the third industrial revolution. Now, the fourth industrial revolution is a little bit different because I was able to put electricity, for example, into the second industrial, and into the third industrial, the aspect of the transistor. But in the fourth industrial revolution, it's less clear what is the underlying technology. And perhaps the main difference that's coming about is that artificial intelligence, which has not been a new, the way of thinking in terms of artificial intelligence hasn't really been a new in itself, but what has made it significantly different is that computing and communications has given impetus to artificial intelligence such that we can start to harness the power of machine learning, deep learning, much more so than ever before. And I think that is one major technology breakthrough, but there are a number of others. The other day, also in one of our through the Faculty of Science, we were exploring, the aspect of of smart motors, but smart molecular motors, which is within the human body, to be able to target certain zones that may have cancer or may have other type of disease elements. And so there are all these new technologies that start to come together, and that confluence of technology is what we are thinking and engaging with in terms of the fourth industrial revolution. But there is a completely different side to the fourth industrial revolution, and as Maria indicated in her welcome, is that it's not, technologies have been there and they've come about in different shapes and forms for a long time. But why is it that we still have poverty, we still have inequality, we still have unemployment? So technology does not always find solution for society. It is that society has, that's where the space has to be first identified, and then see how technology could support the space for society. It is, how does society ultimately benefit through technologies? So I put together just a few charts. I'm not going to use all of them, but I thought that one is this aspect of, South Africa's, yesterday I think our finance minister was giving his own long list of challenges, and one of the things he mentioned in this list, the list of what he calls financial priorities, that there are many, and he's of course supportive of these priorities. But it's the challenge that he has is that the tax base hasn't been growing, the economy hasn't been growing. So how do you then start to engage with different areas of the economy? And so, of course, there are traditional mechanisms that one can use when it comes to economic growth, and those traditional mechanisms, I've labeled them as today in the slide. And then there's the future world, which is also, the physical world will continue to have, in terms of economic growth. South Africa specifically added we have a lot of ocean around us, and so we added the ocean's economy into this mix as another way of being able to grow the economy. And of course, the third industrial revolution, meaning the digital economy, has also come into the picture. Just want to give you some aspects that there are jobs, for example, that are created in the physical world, and we have seen a lot of movement in terms of the economic development zones that are in place. But countries like ours, has also a very high youth population. At the same time, we have high youth unemployment. So how do we then look at creating jobs also in the cyberspace, so that we can, add to the base that we have? Secondly, how do we, how do we create, we have economic development zones in the physical world. Can we create economic development zones in the cyber world? And those are some of the questions that our colleagues in the College of Business and Economics are contemplating. Because that might mean that it may bring about new incentives in being able to develop this world. I have mentioned the oceans economy earlier. There are countries or there are areas, like this is an image from the University of Western Australia, and what they have done to further, because they also have quite a bit of oceans, and in this case it's in the Indian Ocean, where they have tried to use a glider to be able to look into the oceans to determine what is not only the economic potential, but what would be the unintended consequences of harvesting through the ocean's economy, and how do you actually bring about the balance that is needed for sustainable development or sustainability when we actually harvest in the ocean's economy. So it's interesting that the digital world is also going into the oceans, and excuse the pun, but we can go and get video footages at a much better quality and try to analyze this with thanks to the penetration of the third industrial revolution. But as we collect more data, then we're able to utilize that data in a more meaningful way. So I try to chart what is the total data that the world may have in this graph. And if that's the data that we have mined through the third industrial revolution, I'm taking a hypothetical figure. Let's say it's about 25% is the data that we have access to the third industrial revolution. The fourth industrial revolution gives us that ability to harvest the next component of what is what is available through the utilization of machine learning, through deep learning. And a lot of you are already we are already seeing this. when you have your mobile phones. I guess if I actually say, hey, Google, in this room, some of your phones got active, didn't they? Right, and that happens. And I could make it say things by asking it questions and really be disruptive if I wanted to. I probably won't, but I'm sure some of the other speakers would. On the other hand, when we are doing things in the 4IR, there are a lot of unintended consequences that one has to think in terms as well. One, I've just given you the example. Last year, I was speaking at a conference, and we needed to illustrate the impact of cybersecurity. And so what we did to do that was, as you come in, we had created a hotspot. And the name of the hotspot was the same as what the venue would typically use. So for example, if you came here, you saw UJ staff or you saw EduRoam, we would create something like EduRoam, and it would be EduRoam-all or EduRoam-free. And particularly when we see the word free, as people get excited and they connect to that hotspot. Once they've connected to it, of course, you haven't always thought about the cybersecurity implications. And so to illustrate this, so we had a bit of that, and we had a small, online form when you connect to it. And later, as people were very engaged with that online form, we gave them a message and said, thank you very much, we're now going to disconnect you. But a lot of other things could have happened because that, fortunately, we were in control of that hotspot, but it could have also been misused. And that's just one example. And now if you think about, 4IR and how if you scale it, you also scale a number of those challenges. At the same time, what had immediately happened there was that, if we wanted to get, a lot of, data or other information, of course, we did have, a opt-in kind of thing. We could have collected data on people, and it's just the same. I'm sure that you've been told, if you haven't, please read your brochure. We do tell you that we are taking pictures of you during this event, and then once your images go on to, I'm just joking, when it goes onto the websites, then you have contributed not only to the favorable reputation of your organizations, but you have, of course, contributed your facial data so that the search systems can improve in identifying you. But I think the point that I'm trying to make here is that when we think about the fourth industrial revolution, we really have to engage with this topic in a multidisciplinary, multidimensional way. And what now separate to, there's one conversation which is led often by the World Economic Forum in the area of 4IR. There's been another important conversation which has been led by the United Nations in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals. In September 2015, South Africa became a signatory to the Sustainable Development Goals, which has a timeline of 2030. And a key person behind this was Jeffrey Sachs, and I'm sure a number of you have read or viewed his thinking. And I tried to summarize the approach around sustainable development goals as that's something that we also as an institution engage with. And what I put down here is the picture with 4 circles, and these circles deal with geopolitics, they deal with earth systems, they deal with techno-economics, and they deal with social dynamics. And I think if we try to visualize whatever it is that we do, including, if we think about the space in the library, we are actually impacted by all of those 4 areas. Now, unfortunately, we are people, so people are often, let's say if I'm going to just take an example of Zimbabwe, and sometimes people are happy about Zimbabwe, sometimes they're not happy about Zimbabwe, but if you think about Zimbabwe with this principle, then you will realize, you will think about not only the geopolitics or the political components, but you will also think about the earth systems because there was a drought. And then you will also think about the techno-economics because there were sanctions. So how is it, but because we come from a particular angle, we try and engage with the scenario from that particular angle most of the time. And in the area of sustainable development goals, we then think about it from a multidimensional way. So when thinking about the fourth industrial revolution, it would also be key for us to think in a multidimensional way. And maybe this is one approach, but this is also for us to be much more aware of the unintended consequences. On the one hand, you're talking about jobs that are being displaced. And in fact, yesterday, we launched the university's holding company for startups. And the chairperson of that company, who spoke about fintech for about a few minutes in his opening of that program, I mentioned to people afterwards that he's actually been a surgeon for over 10 years. Medical surgeon, just to be clear, because I fully imagine with Libby here, you might be thinking about different other type of surgeons or engineers who do surgery work on machines. But that's what his background is. And he mentioned that even his own job, in a way, he displaced it himself, but he moved from being a surgeon into the fintech space. Who would have thought, right? And so that's the kind of thinking that one starts to find. But now, if you think about this in a multidimensional way, you immediately realize that there will be, while you're talking about displacing job, you're talking about jobs for the youth, you're at the same time putting fear into other people who have gotten into a mode of doing things maybe in a redundant way and are therefore at risk, because those lines of work are likely to be automated unless upskilling occurs in that zone. But of course, upskilling will only be one component of how to address this, and there would be other needs in terms of economic policies that may also be necessary. You've heard of, I think Bill Gates talked about the taxing robots or taxing automation. But of course, if you tax automation, you might have other unintended consequences, because you might discourage what I earlier on referred to as a virtual economic development zone. So one would have to do it in a way that you do it, perhaps you introduce the taxations in a gradual way, so that so that some of the challenges of the 4IR can be avoided. And I think that is key. So whenever I think about 4IR, I try and think about it within these circles. But at the same time, you have to really also think about what's the possibilities when it comes together. So I showed you the picture about going into the oceans, but you can now collect data, and over time, that data can actually build a new story. So the university's strategy is for the global excellence in stature, which we have termed as GS 4.0. And I bring about this book. By the way, for those of you that came late, this has got nothing to do with you, but the book is called Thank You for Being Late. And it's written by Thomas Friedman. It's a really good book. Thomas and his wife Anne visited South Africa in May, and we had the pleasure of hosting him, which is always it's always fascinating. He's written some other books about the flat world and so on. But nice. And I'm going to try and summarize that particular text. And one of the things that he illustrates in his, of course, it's textual. So I'm putting it graphical because it's maybe easier to visualize, is that technology has had a trend, and that's the technology trend, and then there's human adaptability, and it's not, human adaptability has always been there, but I think what's happening today is that the technology is starting to grow and develop at a faster pace than our ability to adapt. Now, usually when that happens in the Earth systems, if you don't always adapt, bad things happens, you get adopted by nature, you get adopted. And that's maybe a bit of why some of this fear exists, is adapt and adopt are just a character away, and we have to select the right characters. And A is the better one, I think. So as an institution, we then said that we have to do something that will help us in terms of an exponential bridge between human adaptability and us harnessing the power of technology, but ultimately to the benefit of our society. So the goal is, how do we transform society by leveraging technology in an appropriate way? That means that we have to learn faster, and we as an institution, we are a big organization. We have 50,000 students. We have close to 6,000 staff members. We are continuing to grow. in terms of our campuses. We have 4 campuses, we have virtual campuses, we have a number of other entities. The other day I was in Sarau in the Northern Cape, and somebody said, do you know that little astronomy area? It's for the it is part of the University of Johannesburg. So I even, in my role, continue to find new locations. By the way, initially I actually thought that they were joking because the people I was engaging with are pretty funny people. And this was really one of our areas. So this is this kind of the scope that universities tend to have. And that means that we're not always very agile in terms of our governance processes, in terms of how we make decisions. And there are new mechanisms of, in fact, bringing agility, including when you maintain aspects of, when you maintain good governance. And so governing smarter has become a very key point. And I think, today we also use a lot of data when it comes to making decisions. And I think that also makes a difference. It's not simply because you hear something in the corridor that you then go and make a decision. That aspect of the corridor is then corroborated with a number of other areas before a decision is arrived at, and ideally supplemented with vast amount of data. But the humanities side is very important because it's not simply about, it's really, we see this as from where the humanities and social sciences come together. And I'll give you one example in our teaching initiatives, is that next year the university will launch a bachelor's degree in politics, economics, and technology. And it may be in the first of its blend, so it's much more a generalist qualification. And normally you would say that how do these guys that start talking about the Fourth Industrial Revolution in terms of the strategic direction in 2018, how do they actually manage to get this implementation right in 2020? Because if you're in South Africa, you would realize that changing and bringing about new qualifications takes a few years. The processes goes through the Council on Higher Education, and by the time they revert back, it's a nationally managed process. So how do we actually do that? And what we did was we took our existing programs in a BA in politics and we evolved that to include aspects of economics and technology, because there is no way that we can wait. I mean, can you imagine me coming here and saying, hey, by the way, we're launching this exciting program, and you're all excited, and then I say, oh, when are you doing this? I said 2022. Imagine me talking to students about this. They would think, what is this guy? I mean, and there would be even people in the crowd that are like, hi, isn't his term ending in 2021? Right? And so so we had to be, the question for us was not how we're not going to do it. The question was, how are we actually going to get it done? And that really forced us to think. Now, there's another dialogue that we've had. We introduced a program called African Insights, which acronyms to AI. And the African Insights was about African leaders, what are the achievements that they have, because it's not always known. For example, the Millennium Development Goals was the contribution of Kofi Annan. That was the first iteration of that, who was a graduate of Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology in Kumasi in Ghana, but it's not always known. It's not always known to a number of our students. And so we decided that we will have an approach that actually brings the different type of achievements of African leaders in the first iteration called AI, African Insights. I appreciate that you're getting distracted by the AI acronym. Last Friday, we launched another program. It also has the acronym AI. This one is in artificial intelligence. And this is a course that all our first-year students will take from next year. It's an online course. So they have the African Insights, then they have the the artificial intelligence, and we're planning to retain AI next year in augmented intelligence, because augmented reality is starting to blend with our reality. And it's already been there, but the technology is becoming cheaper and is becoming more accessible and so on. But it's also because we want to be inclusive. We realize that a number of you can be here, but some people can't be here because of cost. Some people can't be here because we're limited in venue size. Others can't be here because they may be differently abled. And we want to have an ability so that we're much more inclusive to people who can't access us for one reason or the other. And so you can just think about persons with disability also being able to be included in some of our programs through augmented reality and through the leveraging technology. So suddenly, the humanities and the social sciences, actually that thread continues to build. And so it's not only the technology aspects. But you know that you can have strategy, but if you don't, as Maria pointed out, is if you don't develop the culture, then that is a slogan. By the way, interestingly, the book here is Culture Eats Strategy for Lunch, if you're interested. I appreciate that the quotation from Peter Drucker is Culture Eats Strategy for Breakfast, but Kaufman's text is an interesting one about Culture Eats Strategy for Lunch. I guess she used that for indexing purposes, which you folks in the library are quite aware of. This is just a different view of the library, because we often see a library as a place where you go and access text, whether it's electronic text of others. But you forget that the library has also become an area for, institutional repositories have become very big over the last decade. So the institutional repository component is very important here, but also the aspect of open access. South Africa is engaging on open access policies in a big way. At the same time, we're also very carefully understanding how to deal with open access data. So, we are fully aware, and we fully recognize that if you take data, somebody the other day very nicely shared with me data around collecting of information around all the smart meters, which was great. I mean, it looked very good, and he had all these graphs, and he correlated this to electricity patterns, and then he had another one with water. Now what happens is that that's one piece of data. It was very exciting because you can determine when is the off peaks and when is the peaks, and you can do your electricity charging cycles accordingly. On the other hand, if you look very carefully at that data, it started to give me other information. It started to tell me when are people waking up, and the challenge that you have here is that the data in its isolation speaks to one audience. That same data, another data set emerges, another data set emerges, and in the fusion, it then creates a different identity, which those who have the ability could explore and perhaps exploit. And so we are engaging with this open access, the data component, but with that care that there is also that aspect, because the data fusion can be used for good, but at the same time, there is a misuse. And of course, we have to be realistic about both of those. So I'm not going to go into the freemium and premium business models, but it's something that will affect universities in a great way, as we are really working on a premium model. And they, like the program I've talked about on the artificial intelligence, we are looking to make it open access. And last night I was we were having discussion with our MEC for e-government, and I said I think we really have to make this into different South African languages so that we increase and improve accessibility of what are the pros and cons. And then I think we will make it open access. But we make it open access, how do you actually, data is expensive in South Africa. And so we also are looking at how do we make it zero-rated. And if you're not familiar with the concept, it basically means that people will be able to access the educational programs but would not have to pay. They will not pay, but there's always a cost, so it will be subsidized. And maybe there could be some tax incentives to be able to do that. But if you then think about the impact that will bring about. Maker spaces and virtualization, I think there are a number of speakers much more qualified than me to talk about. And I think, interestingly enough, I think the Benjamin Franklin's library had a lot of traditional kind of maker spaces in Philadelphia. And I think some of that is actually coming back just in a different form when it comes to technology. So in my conclusion, I want to say that we have to think in terms of 4IR in its multidimensional way. You may think about 4IR as the fourth industrial revolution. You might think about it as 4 international relations. You might think about it as 4 innovation relations. You may think about the IRs in different way. You might even spell I with a lowercase so that it resembles the iPhone, or I resembles you. But ultimately for us, It's about how do we leverage the power of technology so that we can benefit society. And when resources are constrained, to not see those as challenges, but see those as opportunity, and see how, when in an era of constrained resources, how do we utilize innovation to deliver on impact? At the same time, not be colonized by the algorithms. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. I think the good news is with the opening speakers, they don't get questions. That's really lucky. Thank you very much for that.